Week 1, Unit 1. Exercise 1. Location matters to startups because the people who provide them with the resources they need to grow, revenues, talent, capital, advice, are more than producers of code or PowerPoint decks. They live in houses or apartments and commute to offices. They attend meetings and bump into each other randomly at coffee shops and in hallways. And company founders seeking to build, develop, and sustain vital trust relationships with their startups' customers, suppliers, employees, mentors, and investors must meet with people in person repeatedly. Startups thrive or fizzle depending on the quality of these people and the strength of those relationships, and part of that quality depends on where a startup locates. Pick the right one, and the startup gets the resources that it needs to grow. Pick the wrong place to run the company, and it withers in the struggle to get those resources. Exercise 2. A political economy approach to the mass media has as its starting point the fact that the producers of mass media are industrial institutions, essentially driven by the logic of capitalism, the pursuit of maximum profit. The fact that these institutions are owned and controlled by a relatively small number of people, and that many of the largest-scale firms are based in the U.S., is a situation involving considerable economic and ideological power. A number of accounts have traced the pervasive and increasing inequality in access to information and cultural products due to the commercialization and privatization of broadcasting, libraries, higher education, and other areas of public discourse. A small group of large industrial corporations have systematically acquired more public communications power than any private business has ever before possessed in world history, creating a new communications cartel. The music industry has been part of this process of consolidation. At issue is the consequent question of control of the media and whose interests it operates in, and the relationship between diversity and innovation in the market. Exercise 3. An early memory organizes certain perceived truisms about interpersonal living in a way that, unlike literature or myth, is tailored to the situation of the individual. Early memories are narratives that do not contain timeless rules about interpersonal living that are applicable to many of us. They contain small, tentative, revised rules about one individual's interpersonal world. An early memory would be similar to having a story like Anna Karenina written about oneself. The advantage is that it definitely relates to one's situation. The disadvantage is that it will have been written by us, not by a Tolstoy. When I say that it is a disadvantage not to have memories written by Tolstoy, I do not mean merely that they are less intriguing or interesting or well-crafted than a good novel. I also mean that the writer, the individual, is not as smart about human nature as Tolstoy was. Early memories are literature that is often wrong about its subject matter in some important way. Exercise 4. One foundation of our view of leadership is that leadership is relational. Put simply, you cannot be a leader without followers. Much of early trait theory seemed to ignore this. But trying to distill the characteristics of leaders, it neglected the fact that leadership is a relationship built actively by both parties. In reality, leadership is always a social construct that is recreated by the relationships between leaders and those they aspire to lead. Effective leaders are not simply amalgams of desirable traits. They are actively and reciprocally engaged in a complex series of relationships that require cultivation and nurture. Like all social creations, this web of relationships is easy to break and requires constant recreation. You can confirm this every time you talk to a successful CEO, a sports coach, or a team leader. All will tell you that much of their leadership effort is devoted to the maintenance of particular kinds of relationships with their followers. Exercise 5. In a study, researchers interviewed residents of the state of Victoria over many years to see how life events and personality affected people's happiness. They wanted to know the extent to which a person's personality versus the things that happened to them affected well-being and happiness. Personality might account for, say, 40% of happiness, whereas life events might account for 60%. Alternatively, perhaps personality would turn out to be more important. As the study progressed, it was clear that the same kind of things kept happening to the same people over and over again. Lucky people were lucky again and again. Likewise, people with lots of bad experiences, like relationship breakups and job losses, seemed to encounter one bad thing after another. Their assumption that personality and life events would have separate influences on happiness was wrong. Instead, personality itself had the strongest influence on what happened to people. The optimists had more positive experiences, while the pessimists had more negative experiences. Exercise 6. Online consumer research studies confirm that when visitors land on a website, they experience stay or go moments within the first 10 seconds. If it looks unprofessional or hard to use, they leave and usually won't be back. In other words, your target audience will judge you, your products and services, and your company in a snap, and you're likely to get only one chance to impress them. Given this, all website owners should be doing everything they can to ensure that their online visitors are blown away by their website's look, feel, and navigability. Unfortunately, this is often not the case. Quite a few short-sighted entrepreneurs underestimate the negative impact of poorly written copy, amateurish design, and convoluted navigation. Remember that this is one of those areas where it doesn't pay to be penny wise and pound foolish. It's just too important. Don't annoy or, worse yet, alienate prospective customers because your cousin's friend's aunt's next-door neighbor's brother volunteered to design your website on the cheap. Exercise 7. It is crucial to value differences in our increasingly interdependent world. Even if you are not operating globally, but just in a workplace in a small town, you will find that there is an increasing level of diversity among the people you work with. Old, young, tall, small, black, white, rich, or poor. You should not place more value on one over the other, because they are all needed to form the whole. That's called synergy, meaning that the whole is more than the sum of the individual parts. Value that. It may take some initial adjusting for all parties, but it pays off in the long run. Homogeneity is a thing of the past. Heterogeneity has proven its value. More brains, more values, more perspectives, better solutions, greater output, more creativity, and increased understanding. Those are just some of the advantages of embracing the fact that not all herrings in the barrel are the same. Exercise 8. We apply a finite set of explanations in many different contexts without considering the subtleties of each situation. This is the one-size-fits-all approach to problem solving. People who take this approach have blind spots areas where they fail to recognize that they are missing important things about a situation. Not only do their solutions often fail, they may not even recognize those failures, much less learn from them, so they can devise better solutions. Instead, they tend to force the data to fit their preconceived ideas. This is moving in the wrong direction of the feedback loop, from knowledge to reality. It is starting with what we already believe and insisting that reality fit it. This is not the same as having core values. Core values can still be adapted to fit a variety of circumstances. The problem comes when those values become so rigid that they no longer work well in some situations, when they're applied arbitrarily without carefully evaluating their impact. This happens when we're no longer willing to ask ourselves the tough questions, when relevant feedback is ignored or dismissed. Exercise 9. Of cultivated crops, cereals were of the greatest economic importance in the Mediterranean region in ancient times, just as rice was the basic type of food in East Asia and Indian corn and quinoa in the Americas. Since wild plants were necessarily self-seeding for their survival, the early Neolithic farmers favored individual plants that had developed suicidal mutations that prevented the pod from opening naturally and scattering the seed. Thus, they were able to harvest their crop without losing grains and could later separate the seeds from the pods. Similarly with animals, those that exhibited juvenile characteristics were favored over the strong and bred to eliminate their wild characteristics. This, the earliest form of genetic manipulation by humans, was eventually to make a significant portion of Mediterranean flora and fauna dependent on human assistance in reproduction and survival. Exercise 10. Although globalization processes are often blamed for language loss, in some cases communities and language activists, including linguistic anthropologists, are using web-based technology to save endangered languages. Bud Lane III is one of the last surviving speakers of Siletz Di, an indigenous language in a small community in Oregon. Siletz Di began to decline in the mid-1850s when several cultural groups speaking different languages and dialects were placed on the same reservation. To communicate, they began speaking a Chinook jargon that replaced Siletz Di. Fortunately, this language has been immortalized on a talking dictionary using Lane's own voice. This talking dictionary now contains 14,000 words, and with the language on the Internet, young people in the community are beginning to learn the language once again. They even text in Siletz Di. Other communities with endangered languages are also embracing social media, YouTube, text messaging, and websites as a vehicle for saving their languages. Exercise 11. To be sure, one could try to interpret the unfiltered activity of another person's brain. At first, it would seem like incomprehensible static, but with practice and experience, a person who is visually handicapped would learn that certain kinds of static mean one thing, other kinds other things. The brain is remarkably good at extracting patterns from seeming noise. For example, blind people can learn to see with a lollipop-shaped device resting on the mouth. It converts input from a video camera into electrical pulses. It maps the visual world onto the tongue. The electrical charge is said to feel like popping candy or champagne. At first, the user just feels weird sensations in her mouth, but gradually she learns to associate specific sensations with objects in front of her. After a little practice, users can see doorways and elevator buttons, pick out items at the dinner table, and even read letters and numbers. Though the input is oral and tactile, after a while the user starts to feel as though she is actually seeing. Exercise 12. The title of Carson's book, Silent Spring, was a reference to a world without birds that could be the ultimate outcome of indiscriminate pesticide use. As a scientist, Carson researched her book carefully and grounded it in rigorous science. She made a forceful case for the severe damage that reckless spraying of pesticides had caused to wildlife and exposed the potential threat to humans as well. She did it with a passionate, poetic writing style that made the subject accessible to ordinary people. Up to that time, technology had been seen as the realm of scientists and government regulators, and Americans generally entrusted it to the experts who appeared to understand the complicated details of biology and chemistry. Carson pulled back the curtains. Silent Spring encouraged citizens to become informed and to become actively engaged, and in doing so, helped usher in the spirit of participatory democracy that characterized the 1960s.